As part of an application for a doctorate program, last year I wrote a paper on culture as an attack vector for war making between governments. And the paper focused on how culture and culture building mechanisms, which are in this sense referred to in our case as religions, can be used as mechanisms of entry for subversive attacks on foreign countries, foreign governments, and foreign people. And the purpose of the paper, well, the objective of the paper was to get accepted into a doctoral program, which I've not heard back from yet. But the purpose of the paper then in the writing, the thesis was to illustrate how in effect organizations, governments, and cultures can use cultural elements as specifically ways of attacking one another. And the challenge of the subject itself is that it can be perceived as quite vague. You've got three sets of factors that must be considered. What is and is not considered warfare. And so you start dealing with just war theory. What is and is not considered religion. And so you're dealing with religious philosophy or theology in that sense. And finally, what does or does not constitute an attack. And so you're dealing with sort of not even quite jurisprudence, but something similar. And the challenge that these things bring is that each of the subjects themselves are in a sense in contention. There being different theories about this version versus that version, or this thesis versus that thesis. And so you would think if you combined all three together, you'd have a compounding effect on how complicated they can be. However, last week's interview between Tucker Carlson and Vladimir Putin brought out another example, a really good example of how what I'm talking about can be illustrated. And so the assumptions, and when I'm talking about assumptions in this context, I'm not referring to them with that sort of derogatory negative sense, but rather these are things that we assume to be true. In order to engage in the argument, the assumptions that are going into this one is that, well, we have is that people hold beliefs, and that beliefs themselves um, a belief does not have to correlate to reality to be genuinely believed. So moving onwards, there are two events that have taken place in the last 6 months that can illustrate this a method of using culture as an attack vector. And it's important for us to separate this idea of warfare, using culture as a method of warfare, from the culture war. Now, this is the Redacted Culture Cast, and if you're familiar with my history, you know that in the past I was influenced by the likes of Tim Pool and how he talks about various things. He even has a podcast that he started since I knew him called The Culture War. And the reference to culture war is separate from what I'm talking about. The culture war in the difference between what I'm talking about now and what I believe Tim Pool is talking about when he refers to as the culture war is that what I'm talking about now is an international thing. It is much more of a mechanism. Think the actions of generals, a tactic, strategy in that sense. Whereas what Tim Pool is referring to as a culture war is much more of an internal issue. You could say that a culture war is necessarily, by definition, a civil conflict because it is typically engaged in by citizens within a country. And so I presuppose the existence of nations, even though I'm not trying to go down a von Clausewitz route by implying that the existence of countries is a prerequisite for there to be warfare. So, the two events that have taken place, or two elements that have taken place that are worth identifying, are when Michael Cassidy beheaded the satanic altar in Iowa was it the Iowa State Capitol, or it was their whatever. It was a kind of all the abuzz and all the astir right before Christmas of this last year. And in this event, you had a person, Michael Cassidy, who was attending an event, or he traveled to the Iowa State Capitol because there was a altar to the Church of Satan, or a Satanistic church. And I don't and yes, if you want to get into like the nuances between the different terms of it, I don't care. I will dismiss your argument immediately. Um, so Michael Cassidy goes to the Iowa Capitol, and he finds an altar to Satan, or a Satanistic altar, and proceeds to tear it down. Now, the existence of the Church of Satan is in itself somewhat of a contradiction, and it actually and members of this pseudo organization identified it very clearly when they were challenged on the legitimacy of their claim to having a right to put up an altar in a state capitol building. Now, the challenge that, or the legitimacy of their position, how they actually undermined the legitimacy of their own belief system, is that they admit openly to keeping one foot on each side of a dividing line. They have, on the one hand, when it is convenient for them, their beliefs are not genuine. They on the one hand, they say the entire organization is entirely built to undermine Christian hegemony in the West. So in other words, it is not sort of ex nihilo justified. It is simply a reaction. But then on the other side, it is a genuine belief, because in order to have legitimacy as a religion, it has to be genuine. So the only thing that they genuinely believe is that there is no genuine belief. And there's been spats on Twitter over this. There's been conversations with their own, or confessions from their own population. It's certainly a minority group, but we're not going to go into that length. And so this whole Church of Satan thing essentially embodies what James Lindsay would refer to in a sense as like the Motte and Bailey, where when they're under attack, they're just defending an individual's right to religious freedom. But when they're on the when they are on the offense, they're promoting degeneracy. So they're a legitimate belief when it's a good thing for them, but they're not a legitimate belief. They're just a mockery of belief when they are being criticized as being a bad thing. So what you have here is a dualism. And I think what I would call the idea of the Church of Satan is it's not really so much of a genuine belief system. In fact, if they were to openly come out and say that they worship demons, I think it would be worthy of a form of, say, prejudice. But what the Church of Satan, or the Satanistic Church, um, identifies is that their primary objective is to undermine, is to destroy, it is to cause upheaval, which is exclusively, or almost explicitly, the idea of what I want to refer to as an anti-culture. The purpose of this idea of the Church of Satan, or the grounding theology of the Church of Satan, is not actually an authentic belief system that it's held. It's simply a ideology born out of resentment. And it is evidence that people can believe things not because they are rational, and not because they think they're reasonable, or not because they build an entire worldview, but they will actually post hoc construct their worldview and their values based on resentment. In other words, we like to think in our kind of post enlightenment world that people sit down and they think about what they believe, and they think about what they're rational, what they rationalize, and they think they construct a worldview in their mind. And that worldview, it consists of statements about reality. Again, I am the philosopher talking about metaphysics, but we believe in sort of this post-Platonistic mentality, Platonism we'll get into in a minute, that people sit down and construct their worldview in a somewhat rational fashion. And this, I think this is not necessarily a misplaced hope, but it is this idea, kind of like an intellectual version of imposter syndrome, where everybody else out there must be rational, even though we feel irrational at times. And so we give them the benefit of the doubt that when a person is engaging in an idea, that they came to that by rational means. However, however, what we see here in this anti-religion, this anti-culture that is referred to in this element as the Church of Satan, they don't actually believe anything. They admit they don't believe anything. The only thing that they believe is the opposite of whatever you believe, and the opposite of whatever the Christians refer to as the right and the true and the good. And so in an effect, they aren't necessarily a belief system, but a reaction to a belief system which they've constructed into the form of a pseudo religion for the sake of undermine for the purpose or for the outcome of undermining a social order as well as a government's ability to address such things. Now, what does this have to do with Putin? It is fair to assess that we here in the West do not have an intimate understanding of the various separations of what we refer to generally as orthodoxy. Now, there it has been certainly a rise in orthodox belief in that orthodoxy as a form of Christianity or as a maybe like a branch of Christianity. If you think of Christ as the tree, and there are branches, and sometimes those branches move in slightly different directions, where we all have to ask some questions about what are the left and right limits. And there are certainly millennia of debate on that subject. But orthodoxy to the West can be oftentimes viewed in sort of that evangelical simplification, where orthodoxy is simply people who like icons. Icons are paintings of saints. They're similar in aesthetics to Catholicism, except for their churches have onion bulbs on the top, or they're Eastern Orthodox, or they're Russian Orthodox, and so on and so forth. And why I'm presenting this up is that in the interview between Vladimir Putin, where when in Tucker Carlson's interview of Vladimir Putin, the president of Russia accuses Ukraine of not having a separation of church and state, and he accuses him of not having a separation of church and state, and thus, in some sense, being some sort of a Nazi because Zelensky banned orthodoxy in his country, in the country of Ukraine, or at least this is how the accusation goes. And instead of getting into the details and the weeds of what this ban looked like or what this argument looked like, I want to make sure that I want to paint these two examples: the proposed ban on, let's just call it orthodoxy in Ukraine, and the issue of the Church of Satan in America. Now, orthodoxy, in my travel to the Eastern European countries, one thing that was interesting to learn more of, and mind you, having a background in church history, it's intriguing how deep we can learn about the different historical paths that people have taken. For example, even in that interview with Putin, he talks about how Russia was baptized into orthodoxy many, many centuries ago. And so one of the things that I encountered in Ukraine and Poland and Slovakia was how people who considered themselves within the Orthodox Church talked about the schism, which was the split between the Catholic Church and the Orthodox Church, as if it was like their grandparents, even though it was well more than a thousand years ago. We're looking at, this it was many, 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 many years ago, many generations back. And so we in America have different denominations. We have Presbyterians and Baptists. We have Methodists. We have what is just the big tent evangelicals. There are different there are these different denominations of what might fall under the loose term of Protestantism. There are Reformed, and then there is even subsections of the Reformed Church. And what you find, such as is in the case of Methodism, that the origins of this form of this, maybe this not when I say sect, sect, I'm saying that I'm talking about different denominations within the church. The origins of these different denominations can oftentimes be traced to a combination of political and social movements, Methodism notwithstanding. And so, or we're not withholding Methodism from the example. And so, if you look at the complicated history of the American church and the Western church, and and you start to see how different forms or titles, or the Presbyterians or the Quakers, even how they came from different social and political movements and also theological concerns, if we apply that to the West, would it not be appropriate to apply it to the East? And so there were three different groups of people that I encountered when I was in Ukraine, because I was interested in talking to them about their theology and their belief systems, and also just to talking to church members in that part of the country at the time. Uh, the It would be foolish to not apply our, at least some understanding of what we as humans encounter here in the West into what happens in the East. And there were three main church groups that I would encounter. There was Greek Orthodox, which had left Orthodoxy, as in like kind of split from the Orthodox heritage and rejoined back with Catholics. And so they were a special, they referred to themselves as like a special section of the Catholics that were permitted to be married. But you saw almost kind of like this socio-political attachment where they had sort of branched off from traditional orthodoxy to regraft into Catholicism, or at least the Catholic Church polity, or the Catholic Church body. And so that would be Greek Orthodox, and then there was the broader term of Eastern Orthodox, which is really what we tend to think of when we think of orthodoxy. And then there was the Russian Orthodox. And when I encountered Greek and Eastern Orthodox churches, they talked about the Russian Orthodox as sort of this cult that saw Putin as the reincarnation of Jesus. And so you could imagine that if you are the government of Ukraine, which has been invaded by Russia, then it would be appropriate to ban the practice of Russian Orthodoxy, if indeed Russian Orthodoxy is a cult that worships um Vladimir Putin, or at least places some sort of divine intervention within him as an individual. And so the challenge that we're seeing here, and remember, you can find duplicity where you want to. The challenge that we're identifying here is in this case of America that we're talking about, most of us Americans are more or less intellectually capable of recognizing that whatever this thing is that is referred to as the Church of Satan isn't an authentic belief system that people hold in the same way that they hold to, say, Christianity or Islam even. And if and in the case of Ukraine, if Zelensky is justified in banning banning the practice of certain forms of orthodoxy because they have too close ties to Russia, then if we morally justify that, what are the consequences that apply to us here at home? For example, if we ethically justify the actions of Zelensky and we believe that what he is doing is right by banning Russian Orthodoxy within the nation state of Ukraine, or within the state of Ukraine government, the country of Ukraine, then we would have to, in order to remain intellectually consistent, ban certain forms of Islam in the United States. And while certainly we look for people who are if we're dealing with some forms of legitimate immigration, which is often seriously in question anyway, uh, what we recognize when we look at our own media is that our own media is very quickly to call any sort of scrutiny towards Islam and Muslims as a form of racism and bigotry, and perhaps they're duplicitous when they socially accept the prevention of Russian Orthodoxy or the cultural persecution of Russian Orthodoxy in the Ukrainian state. But at the same time, if the Ukrainian state is actually at war with Russia, why would they abide the existence of a movement, a religious movement in this sense, that calls into question the legitimacy of their position at all? It's not so simple of a task. And we look at it in America, where we see pseudo religions and pseudo ideologies and these sort of resentment ground mentalities like the Church of Satan and Satanism, or we look at these kind of things in the United States and we go, huh, that's odd. They're taking advantage of our belief in the separation of church and state. But then we look at somebody that would be, in this case, a belligerent or an aggressor in a war, the president of Russia, and understand that he is also accusing his enemy of doing the same. And so it's a game and a question of belief systems. And what do we believe to be right and true and good? And how can countries take advantage of what we actually believe in how we formulate our government by using culture as an attack vector? Certainly, the Church of Satan has produced nothing good in this world except for an upheaval and a destruction of people's lives. It has not in its end goal, it must at least admit to being some form of a lie, a deception. But what would we do if we found out that the Church of Satan, or whatever this Satanism church, or an intellectual copycat equivalent of it, was it actually funded by, say, the CCP, or funded by the Kremlin itself? If that these ideologies that arrive and appear in the United States are actually devised and developed by our enemies and funded and supported, or maybe recruited and identified by foreign entities that seek to use them to undermine our own cultural identity. See, you can go to war against another country, you can send troops and soldiers and bombs to destroy them, and then try to take their resources and their land and their population as slaves, or you can undermine their ability to act in the world by forcing them into an eternal process of, well, whatever the wokeism is today, but some sort of eternal internal turmoil and destruction and collapse. Now, how is it then that we respond to both of these actions? The I'm highlighting these two scenarios as cultural attack vectors for war making because they suggest two different sides of a coin, two different elements within our worldview. The problem that Zelensky deals with, or the problem that we deal with in the case of Zelensky and Ukraine, is that Russian Orthodoxy has been around for a long time. And we as Americans would be a little bit foolish to assume we are fully understanding of their theology, as well as how much of a cultural institution that is. If we condemn the destruction, or the if we were to condemn, in a sense, the persecution of the American church by our own government through through the avenues of like the LGBTQ thing, or what's another one? I mean, the trans rights thing is a good example, or affirmative action. Do we not then also have to affirm that it is not appropriate for Zelensky to prevent the practice of Russian Orthodoxy within his state? And that goes to questions of authoritarianism and and moving on. So, illustrating these two events, these two not events, but these two circumstances illustrate somewhat of the left and right limitations of what culture as an attack vector for war making might include. On the one hand, if we define it too broadly, legitimate belief systems and authentic beliefs get wrapped up and marketed, or wrapped up and persecuted by the state, such as in the case of what Zelensky may be doing with the Russian Orthodox Church. In fact, these are not hypotheticals. These are issues that we very much so realistically deal with in our day and age, and will continue to do so more as the secular age comes to an end. And on the other hand, on the other end of the bracket, on the other end of our understanding of cultural warfare, or culture as as an attack vector for war making, we have people who do not believe in what we believe, but use our own arguments as a cudgel against us. And that would be illustrated in this idea of the Church of Satan, where it may not be the case even that they do actually worship Satan, so to speak, but that their entire belief system is a meme, or it is a mockery of belief. But what we identify in that issue is that this institution, this organization that calls itself the Church of Satan, is either illegitimate because it does not believe in what it believes authentically, or it is illegitimate because what it believes in is the antithesis of the good for the purpose of being the antithesis of the good. And so we would have to investigate the latter, this idea of the Church of Satan, and concern ourselves with where it infiltrates our society, because it is a perfect example of a cultural mechanism as an attack vector for war making. In that case, what is it? Where is its funding? How is it supported? Where does it find its footing in this country? And why would we permit it to continue? If we are against the use of the state because we believe in the separation of church and state, if we are against the state from intervening on the religious affairs of its citizens, then we must also concede that it is the civic duty of the citizens to concern themselves with what goes on in their communities. And it is in our own communities where we have that duty manifest. And so, if you have, in this case of Michael Cassidy, somebody setting up a Church of Satan, then it is your responsibility in your area to concern yourself with whether or not that will take root in your culture, and recognize that, yes, to some extent, the satanic panic was correct, and that if we allow things to allow the antithesis of the good to manifest, and we are expected to not only tolerate it but affirm it, it will have consequences on our culture and on our conscience. So, this has been an illustration of two examples of how culture can be used as an attack vector for war making. And if you enjoyed this show, you can follow us, send this to other people, or leave comments below, or you can also head over to redactedllc.com and check out our shop there. We will talk to you soon. Go forth and conquer.